ladies and gentlemen, announcing the beginning of a new series, The Ancient Engineers. You've heard that the Romans were great engineers. We're going to learn quite a bit about that. We're going to learn what the Romans inherited, what they bequeathed to the later ages, but we're going to study in depth first the ancient world, and we're going to start with Sprague de Camp and his book The Ancient Engineers, published in 65, I believe, 1960 originally, republished in 62 and 3, and this was printed in 1993. We're going to start on page 1, and we're going to take the first opening paragraphs, and then we'll skip down quite a bit. Civilization, as we know it today, owes its existence to engineers. He says engineers are the basis of civilization. So that's a heavy case he's going to make, because Ayn Rand made the case for ideas. We might find that these are subservient to ideas at the end of the day, but he's saying that, quote, civilization as we know it owes its existence to engineers. Continuing, these are the men who, down the long centuries, have learned to exploit the properties of matter and the sources of power for the benefit of mankind. By an organized, rational effort to use the material world around them, engineers devised the myriad comforts and conveniences that mark the difference between our lives and those of our forefathers thousands of years ago. The story of civilization is, in a sense, the story of engineering, that long and arduous struggle to make the forces of nature work for man's good. The story of engineering, pieced together from dusty manuscripts and crumbling relics, explains as well the state of the world today as all the accounts of kings and philosophers, generals, and politicians. To appreciate the accomplishments of the engineers, we must understand the changes that have taken place in human life during the last 1,000,000 years. 1,000,000 years ago, at the beginning of the Pleistocene period, our ancestors were small, ape-like primates, much like the man-apes whose fossil remains have been found in Africa. He goes on for several paragraphs, which we can skip, so we go down a bit. Because of the difficulty of getting food in Pleistocene times, only a few 100,000 people existed on the entire face of the globe. Man was an endangered species at the time, I interject to say. Continuing, but there is no reason to think that we today are one bit cleverer than the men of 8000 BC, at the time of the great Neolithic agricultural revolution that turned hunters into peasants. This has also been stated that if you could bring a genetically modern human to 1000 or 100,000 BC, you wouldn't be able to tell any difference between him and someone from 100,000 years ago. For one thing, 10,000 years is too short a time for evolution to have had a measurable effect. For another, many geneticists, get this, so is civilization due to us getting better and better? Many geneticists believe that civilization causes the human stock slowly to degenerate by enabling persons with unfavorable mutations to live and breed, when in a wild state they would quickly perish. Quite a bit of ink's been spilt on that. However that may be, man has spent about 99% of his history, since he first learned to make tools, as a hunting and food-gathering tribesman. So how do you like that? We learned to make tools, and then for the next 99 years, metaphorically, we just hunt and gather. And in the very last year, we figured out to do more than hunt and gather. We started using it for plows and stuff. That was 5,000 years ago, 6,000, 7,000 years ago. That's the last 1% of human existence. Civilization has arisen only during the remaining 1% of this time, since 9 to 10,000 years ago, when men discovered how to raise crops and tame animals. These discoveries enabled a square mile of fertile land to support 20 to 200 times as many people as before, and freed some of these people for other specialized occupations. This revolution seems to have taken place in the hills that curve round to the north of Iraq and Syria. From Iraq and Syria, the agricultural revolution quickly spread to the valleys of the Nile and Indus, which in their turn became centers of agricultural radiation. The agricultural revolution brought about changes fully as drastic in people's lives as those caused by the Industrial Revolution of the last 2 centuries. Permanent villages took the place of temporary campsites. Interesting. There was a time period, you know. For example, there was a time period in America where more and more frequently you saw computers. They got cheaper and cheaper. There was a time period in America where more and more frequently you saw paved roads. They were mostly dirt and gravel up till then. There was a time in America where you saw more and more trains. Up till then it was horses. There was a time in the history of mankind when you saw more and more towns. Up till then it was many teepee villages or whatever. Interesting that there was actually, you know, that happened. There was a transitional period where the first and second and ninth and 100th town was actually established by actual people. Had to be done. In another 3,000 or 4,000 years, some of the farming villages of the Near and Middle East grew into cities. Then, with a rush, came metals, writing, large-scale government, science, and all the other features of civilization. Bam! As soon as we settle down into cities and get specialization going, it doesn't take any time at all in the sense of glacial movement of anthropology for us to go from writing to the moon. So that shows you how much power there is in dealing with the world through concepts, using concepts to deal with the world, which is what happens when you use writing. Then you can actually use concepts and communicate over generations, and science becomes possible. Philosophy, thinking, and what you can do with that, literally 99% of our history running around trying to kill something for dinner tonight. Then in the last 1%, just by starting to use concepts explicitly through written language, just that 1% we go to the moon. That's no exaggeration. As farmers learned to raise more food than they themselves needed, other men were able to spend all their time in making useful things, which they exchanged for surplus foods. Thus specialization arose. And a bang at metals, writing, large-scale government. Human society had long known a couple of specialists, the tribal priest or the wizard, and the tribal chief or the war leader. Ayn Rand would call them Attila the Hun and the witch doctor. As specialization increased, merchants, physicians, poets, smiths, and craftsmen of many kinds came into being. Instead of making their own houses, carts, wells, and boats, men began to buy them from workmen skilled in these arts. Soon the arts advanced to the point where even a wise and experienced workman could not know all that had to be known about his craft. Then we skip just a bit there. It says slavery, and a part we skip. Slavery was at first a human invention that made it no longer necessary to slaughter one's prisoners of war. They used to just slaughter people as prisoners of war, then they invented slavery. Never anything crazier. We skip that paragraph. Wealth and experience piled up. Men undertook projects too large for a single craftsman, even with the help of his sons and apprentices. These projects called for the work of hundreds or thousands of men, organized and directed toward a common goal. Hence arose a new class of men, the technicians or engineers, who could negotiate with a king or a priesthood for building a public work, plan the details, and direct the workmen. These men combined practical experience with knowledge of general theoretical principles. Sometimes they were inventors, as well as contractors, designers, and foremen, but all were men who could imagine something new and transform a mental picture into physical reality. The prime movers, individuals who did things for society never done before. Invention has been going on ever since our apish ancestors learned to feed a fire and flake a flint. Why has he got to throw all that alliteration at us? But the conditions under which invention take place and the pace of invention have changed greatly since the beginnings of historic times. Some primitive inventions, like the manioc squeezer of the South American Indians, the Australian boomerang, and the Eskimo toggle joint harpoon, are extremely ingenious.